Hello everyone, welcome back to the Tetraphobia vlog, my action roguelike game set in a world of floating islands that I just released into early access. So far, early access has been a bit of a wild ride, but one of the most concerning things is the high refund rate that Tetraphobia has. I did a bit of research and Steam says the average refund rate is usually between 10 to 20%. Tetraphobia is currently sitting at a 25% refund rate, and that's with quite a small number of units sold. I looked into the reasons why people were refunding my game, and the biggest reason was that people were not finding it very fun. To be honest, this was a bit of a heartbreaking moment because I really felt like Tetraphobia was a fun game, so I was surprised to see so many refunds for this reason. So after a quick cry in the shower, I started reaching out to friends and community members to see if they had any issues with the game. The outcome of these conversations was that people were finding the game too challenging, and they were getting frustrated at various design choices that stopped them enjoying the game. With that said and done, there were three key areas that I wanted to focus my efforts on. The first of these was finding fun power-ups faster. I think one of the most fun features in Tetraphobia is the unique combinations of power-ups you can get, choosing which power-ups you want to use and how you want to combine them to construct really interesting builds. I really want to capitalize on this system as much as possible, so let's look at two ways we can improve it. The first issue comes from the unpredictability of the island layouts that get generated. If we take a look at this island layout here, you can see that the player has to fight through two islands before they get to their first power-up. And an even worse example here where the player has to fight through 4 islands before they get their first power-up, which is right before the boss room. You can see how this would be annoying for players because they'll feel severely underpowered before they get that first power-up and start working on their build. So to fix this, I made sure that the first island that spawns in every single layout is always guaranteed to be the power-up island. This leaves things less open to randomness, which you'll see is a common theme throughout this vlog. So now that we have players always guaranteed to get their first power up, the next thing we want to do is make sure that power up feels impactful. Right now the power ups are randomly chosen, which means that the first selection of power ups you get might be something that's not even all that useful at that point in the game. This isn't so bad later on in the game when you've already got an established build, but early on when you want to play around some interesting mechanics, you want to have that first decision feel really impactful. The change I made here is just to make it so that a subset of power-ups, the really impactful ones, were the only ones that get offered on that very first power-up. This was a really good change. At the start of every new run, I got to decide what kind of build I wanted to construct for that particular run. Now let's take a look at the second major issue. The combat loop for Tetraphobia essentially revolves around enemies spawning into the room, you fighting them with your 2 bows, whatever power-ups you have, maybe some bombs, and then rinse and repeat for every single room. It's important this combat system feels fun because it's what you're going to be spending 90% of the game doing. One of the issues that was affecting combat is the visibility of enemies. Some people felt like they were really hard to spot in certain scenarios when you have a lot of VFX on the screen, and some people found it annoying that you couldn't see the enemies behind objects. Initially I was taking a look at the brightness settings for enemies and seeing if I could just give them a certain amount of brightness that helped illuminate them from the islands. The results of this weren't really great, and instead I went for a different approach. I experimented with putting this outline shader on top of the enemies that give them this really dark outline. This really helps the enemies stand out from the island and gives them a much more identifiable silhouette. And an added benefit of this is that the shader can be seen behind objects. The next issue that was really plaguing combat balance was the way that enemies are spawned. I'm sure you can guess what the problem was at this point: too much RNG. Let's take a look at the existing spawning system and why it's so flawed. The current system looks at predefined spawn locations on islands and then decides on which enemies it wants to spawn there. The problem with randomly selecting spawn points is it has no context for which side the player is going to actually enter the room from. For example, if we were going to place 4 enemies into this room, we might select this grouping of 4, or this grouping of 4, or even this grouping of 4. It's completely random. And depending on which side the player enters the room, you can see certain groupings of enemies could prove problematic, especially when it's an archery game where you're wanting to fight enemies from a distance. My solution to this was to make sure that the position of the player was being taken into consideration when deciding on which spawn points to use for enemies. Initially I took an approach that would always use the spawn points that were furthest away from the player. This did help, but it created a new problem where enemies lost their identity. With melee enemies being spawned so far away, it was really easy to pick them off with the bow. And even range enemies to a certain extent, you could outrange them with your bow. And this just made the islands way too easy. So the next approach I went for is to still keep the context of the player, but when you're spawning melee enemies, put them within a certain distance close to the player and keep the ranged enemies away. This worked really well and allowed me to balance the enemies a lot easier. Since I now know that melee enemies are going to spawn way closer to the player, I can give them higher health bars, which feels representative of their identity. And the ranged enemies, since I now know that they're going to be spawned a fair distance away from the enemy, they can be lower HP but present a more damaged threat. Now we have a nicer spawning location for enemies. The second thing to look at was the types of enemies that were spawning in rooms. The existing system would choose from a predefined set of groupings of enemies and then it would place them into the room. The problem with this is that the difficulty level between two groupings of enemies could be significantly different. For example, one group could be a small group of exploding enemies that you could take out with one shot, versus another group of enemies that could contain two elites, and that was a much more difficult fight to battle between. Once again, the solution here is to take out some of that randomness and try to keep things as balanced as possible, and just sprinkle in a very small amount of RNG. This required a complete rewrite of the existing spawn system to a completely new way of deciding which enemies to spawn. Tetraphobia has 3 different sized islands that you get. It's usually a small island, a medium island, or a large island. I gave each of these islands a specific number of points that they were allowed to assign to enemies. And then I grouped certain enemies into certain groups based upon their difficulty level. So let's take a look at some of the example spawns that could happen with this pointing system. You could have 1 ranged enemies with 3 small enemies, 2 ranged enemies with 1 small enemy, or maybe an elite enemy with 2 small enemies as well. There's still some RNG here, but as long as we get the groupings of our enemies right and make sure that the difficulty levels for enemies in a specific group feels the same, we should end up with a much more balanced island every time. I did a whole bunch of playtesting and there were a few number tweaks I had to make to enemy health bars and damage with this new system. But overall the game felt a lot more balanced and there was no situations where I felt overwhelmed with a specific grouping of enemies or even underwhelmed by something that wasn't challenging enough. Okay, excellent. We've got a much more balanced combat system. We have players wanting to find power-ups and create interesting builds, being given agency in their choices. Let's look at the final issue that was causing frustration for players. Tetraphobia has a trinket shop that lets you upgrade your trinkets, improving your base stats. It's a really important system that lets players get more powerful as they venture deeper and deeper into the fractured sky. The problems with the existing system is that you're instantly overwhelmed by choices of what you should upgrade, with every trinket being shown immediately even if some of them are behind locks. This can be really confusing, but it's also really annoying for those players who do want to unlock those trinkets, because you have to invest a large number of resources before you can even really see what that trinket's going to give you. I changed this so that instead of being immediately overwhelmed by all of your options, in the beginning you're only given 2 trinkets. The other trinkets will unlock naturally later when you reach certain milestones, such as defeating one of the titans for the first time. This does a much better job of introducing players to the upgrade mechanics. The second problem came from the cost of upgrades. All upgrades in the trinket shop cost the same amount of currency that you need. The problem with this system is it makes it hard for new players to start getting enough resources to get their first few upgrades. Instead, we want to make it so that the first few upgrades are quite cheap. It allows players to slowly start getting some power under their belt, and then we slowly increase the cost of those upgrades. It also creates some excitement around the trinket shop, since you'll have this handy little notification above our head when you finally unlocked a new trinket. I was able to apply the same logic to other NPCs that are on the home island, such as this ramen chef. Certain meals will only become available when you find certain resources for the first time, instead of instantly unlocking everything. After playtesting this a bunch myself and giving the build to some friends that were raising some of those early frustrations, it feels like Tetraphobia is in a much nicer spot right now. This was a real learning experience for me and felt like a crash course in game design. I always find these kind of issues when you look back seem so obvious, but when you're working on something for so long you kind of miss some of these details, and it's really important to have that feedback. I plan on releasing this patch in the next few days, and I'll let you guys know the results in a future vlog. Okay, and that wraps up all of the changes for this vlog. I'll catch you in the next one where I'll be talking about adding some new content into Tetraphobia.